start. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mats Julius Stensrud from Norway originally. By the way, my daughter is studying in Norway.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I'm going there quite frequently now.
Where?
In Kristiansand.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah, very nice place.
Yeah.
So Mats is a associate tenure track professor at EPFL. And for those who don't know EPFL is part of the ETH system that we have in Switzerland, which is the federal universities, if you like, or federal research institutions. This place here is a cantonal university, and our education system has sort of these two levels. The federal level with the ETH and the 6 research institutes, for example, EMPA or EVA and the PSI Institute in physics, etc. And then we have all the cantonal universities. So Mats is quite special. He's got degrees in mathematics, medicine, he's a medic, okay? Medicine and statistics, which is quite an unusual combination. And he was, until before he came to EPFL in Lausanne, he was a Fulbright scholar at Harvard School of Public Health, where he worked with Miguel Hernan, whom we all know and also collaborate with occasionally. He is interested in answering causal questions that are practically meaningful. I like that. And he has a substantive interest in applying novel methods to real data. And that's exactly what we are all about, I think. So he shares a lot of our interests. He is famous for papers on a causal framework for classical statistical estimates in failure time settings with competing events. That's a paper that was very impactful. And also your comment on testing the proportional hazards assumption also is very widely cited. And more recently, you wrote a paper on how to detect and reduce potential sources of biases in studies of COVID-19. That was also impactful and, of course, very topical. So, Mats is going to talk about causal inference and competing events, really based on that paper I mentioned to some extent, probably developed further. The floor is yours, and thanks again for coming.
Thank you so much, Matthias, for the very nice introduction. And I hope you can hear me well on Zoom as well. If not, raise a hand in the Zoom room. It's a pleasure to be here. First, my heart is in medicine, and although when my brain gets distracted with a lot of mathematical things, I think that's everything I want to do should have at least be relevant. So I'm at EPFL. I work mostly in the mathematics department. I'm admittedly in a corner of that department where I'm in the more applied corner, but it's now very nice to be and see some people who care about subject matter problems even more than there. So the things I will do today will concern competing events and some generalizations. Most of this work is published, and some of the things are add-ons that are not published, but I can point you to the sources if you have questions. And I just want to get started. So before that, I will also do a very brief advertising, is that I will recruit more people. So now I have a lot of methodological people, but also more applied people that are based in biostatistics and epidemiology, broadly defined. So you can think about that both PhD and postdoc level. Just write me an email. Let's jump directly into some examples. And then I've written a lot about separable effects, but there will also be other estimates. So when I introduce them, I will do that in a context where we also discuss other ways of analyzing data. But in order to understand where we go, let's do the example. So I'll do something very vanilla and simple. So the simple setting is this, and this looks very boring because it's a trial from the 1980s, and that's now more than 40 years ago, so why do we care? And maybe we don't care as much precisely about these curves, but we will develop something that may be more interesting. So this looks like a very classical analysis of a randomized control trial. And I could have done an observational study too, but there's a reason why I do a trial, because we believe that everything works in a trial. We have randomized, and suppose the randomization was perfect, and then association is somehow causation. So the simple question, which is a warm-up, is this. So the full curves below here, the red one is just a count. So this is a cumulative incidence of death due to prostate cancer among those who got estrogen therapy. The black line is the count of, among those who got placebo in red. And here is the count of prostate cancer death among those who got this estrogen therapy called DES. So it's estrogen. So why do you give that to men with prostate cancer? What was their reasoning? It was that if you give them estrogen, you stop their production of testosterone. And if you have no testosterone production, the prostate cancer cells don't grow because they need that in order to grow. And keep in mind other ways you could intervene to remove testosterone production, because we can get back to it, but there are other ways. That's what they gave here, quite primitive. So less people die of prostate cancer in the treatment arm compared to placebo. But then we look at death due to any other cause, and then more people die. So more people die here among those who got treated versus placebo. So what do we conclude? Do we say more people died because estrogen had a potential side effect? And what could that side effect be? The increased cardiovascular risk, because we know that from postmenopausal women. That's its classical example in causal inference, where observational studies showed it seems to be beneficial in naive observational study analysis, but then afterwards they did causal analysis and RCTs, in fact, and they saw that estrogen therapy increases cardiovascular risk in some postmenopausal women. Or could we just say, well, when less people die of prostate cancer, they have to die of something, and that would be something else. So what is the good explanation? And this is an RCT, it's perfectly executed. There was almost no loss to follow up. They just counted deaths. They can do that among men with prostate cancer. I mean, they rarely move from the country. You see what's going on. So my point is, this was an RCT with no clear failures, but we still have this interpretational issue. So you can immediately just say, why don't you just plot these curves on, or add these curves together? So then you would get all-cause mortality, so plus the dashed with the full line, and you'll get something that's almost similar between the two arms. Almost no difference in all-cause mortality. And I would say that's true. Maybe that's all the patient is interested in. But when you look at mortality and outcomes in these studies, they are also interested in this cause-specific outcome. So death due to prostate cancer, we can discuss how to classify that. Or in cardiovascular trials, they look at MACE, this major cardiovascular event. In infectious disease settings, such as COVID, what's the outcome of interest? It's getting infection. That's also a specific outcome. If you're dead, you cannot get infection. So we have these competing risk settings in a lot of clinically relevant situations. And here was just to illustrate this prostate cancer example, that the reason for giving the estrogen therapy was to, we don't need to go into the biology, but in fact, it's sometimes important to understand the statistics. So we need that background knowledge to inform a statistical analysis. But the key here was that estrogen would act on the pituitary gland, that could reduce some, would have this feedback loop with other hormones that in turn would stop the production of testosterone. Okay, but you may also just say, why do I make a big deal about something so simple? We have a lot of statistical tools in our toolbox. So we know, for example, what censoring is. So we could just censor those who had the competing event. We could fit the classical hazard model. We have a fine and grained model if it's a competing event setting, or these cause-specific hazards, or some classical survival models, I don't know, for hazards. And you could report whatever estimate, the hazard ratio. So those who know we would understand that I'm rhetorical and ironic right now, because we can't just go and do this algorithmic way of structuring data analysis. So that's point one. I don't just get the data set and then say, oh, this is a competing risk data set, so then I have this method, and then I just do this. The other way of thinking about it, which I like much more, is the following. So start with the question of interest. This is causal inference, like first principles, but you have to start with the question that is clinically meaningful. And if you just censor the competing event, what kind of questions are we actually targeting in that situation? So if we want to be using more jargon, what is our estimate or parameter of interest? And this is not something I'm saying that's new, that's been in this literature for a long time. I said one paper from 1986, but I could have cited many others. And then we have the problem that Diaz also mentioned briefly in the beginning, like if you just fit the Cox model, we need some justification for fitting that Cox model. And what about the setting where the hazards are not proportional? And in some way, I may exaggerate this a bit. Maybe it's not that important with small violations, but still that has consequences for inference. And if you don't need to do it, why do we do it? And we should be aware of these things. As an anecdote, I can go back to another example later where it actually means something. It's problematic. And then that's just about model fitting, so the statistics, but also the interpretation of the parameter we need to be careful about. So what kind of scale is it nice to communicate things to patients and decision makers? And I've never heard any patient talk about hazard ratios, but they talk about 5-year risk of dying after a cancer, 5-year mortality. Infectious disease settings, they're very concerned about their risk in the near future of getting an infection and so forth. But none of in the COVID settings, I've never heard any politician talk about hazard ratios either. So maybe we should target parameters that they care about. But before I go further and be a bit more technical, but it will be reflected by examples, we need to be clear about some terminology. So when I talk about estimand, I mean what we are interested in, the question we are interested in answering. So this is the cake we want to bake. And the estimator is just an algorithm, so just some stuff we do on the computer and then the R package or Stata or whatever you want that try to target this estimate. But a lot of what I will focus on is the first part. And then the estimate is just a bad copy of what you get out in the end. So that was something I got from one of my students in America when I was there. They're a bit more formal about this. So now I've already said this quite a lot of time, but the reason why I'm stating it a lot of the times is that it seems to be misunderstood. So we recently went through some claims made by pharmaceutical investigators and statisticians, because now they have realized, so this is an anecdote, so they also see these settings. I know you guys work a lot on infectious diseases and not that much directly with the pharmaceuticals, but now there's this big wave after this ICH9 addendum in the pharmaceutical industry, where it specifically says they have to be precise about their causal estimate in their analysis. Okay. But they neglect one fact, because they don't motivate these estimates by the clinician's questions. There are some statisticians there just stating, oh, this is a formal estimate, so let's target this kind of thing. So this has led to some issues, I think, in this addendum, and also about how to study them. So I will get back to this, but this is interesting because it now seems to spread more widely also out of our closer environments in more academic and epidemiological statistics. Okay, so the first task is then to translate the question that we are interested in answering to something that we can study more formally, and that we get some mathematical guarantees that actually works when we use the computer algorithm to implement the R program. But then that's one thing. But the other thing is also we need to be careful about the assumptions, and we know that intuitively, and we reason about confounding and selection bias and draw graphs all the time. But I will also discuss this a bit in these clinical trial settings where you would believe that you don't need any extra assumptions, but you actually do. And then I would briefly talk about estimation, which I think I'm spending a minimal time on. Okay, so the only notation that we would need is the following: the binary treatment. So in this case, one is DES, this estrogen treatment. 0 is placebo. And for the sake of the argument, I have discrete intervals. And that's not because time couldn't be continuous, but it's because the graphs are discrete, and just to make things a bit simpler. Things will generalize. And the outcome I'm interested in is here death due to prostate cancer, which is my Y, at some time, and the time is indicated by K. And then we have a competing event, which in this example was death due to any other cause. And even if it's a randomized trial, I may measure something at baseline. So their age, their gender, their previous diseases, and so forth. There could be censoring, there could be other time varying covariates, but I'm simplifying the setting a little bit, but everything generalizes. Okay, so this graph looks too much, and I don't expect you to just look at it and say, okay, this is how this setting is represented by causal graphs, but it will sometimes be useful to go to causal graphs. And even if it looks a bit cluttered and too much, it really represents what we know. And the nice thing about causal graphs is that they are not only useful for people to draw, like you can ask anyone to draw, do you think there's any common cause of A and any of the outcomes? And they will say no, because A was randomly assigned. So it was assigned by a coin flip. So it shouldn't be anything that causes A. So there should be no arrow into A except this coin flip that causes nothing. We don't need it. And so forth, you can build it up. My point here is that all I do here today, I will not go back to the graphs all the time, but you can check the assumptions. Okay, let's be a bit more concrete. In more than graphs, we need the following. We need more than the usual statistical language. And what's the reason why that? It's because if we only have statistical notation, these Y's and these A's, we don't distinguish between prediction or just doing, looking at associations from causal inference, which is about what will happen if we intervene. So we need some extra language, and this is the last notation I will introduce. It's just the difference between observing and fixing, or observing or intervening. Okay. And when I say I need this extra language, that comes in the next slide, where we use superscript to denote counterfactuals. So Y superscript A is death due to prostate cancer if I force you to get treatment little a, which means if A is 1, this means that Y A equals 1 would be your status of being dead or alive at this time when you're treated. And the same with 0. And the same with B. Okay. This part is not what's exciting, but now comes more exciting part. So when we have this notation, we can see what is done in the literature already with a new lens. And the new lens is that we can use this notation. So basically, these curves I already showed you were really distinct, because in the randomized controlled trial, we know that the intervention is given randomly. So for this particular quantity, we can equate it with the normal cumulative incidence function. So what does this mean? I'm looking at the probability of being dead under treatment at some point k, and this was really what I plotted in this curve. So what would happen if I censored individuals when they had the competing events? Because that's easy to do in the computer. We have lost the follow-up and we have other things, and you just say, oh, that's censored. Well, if you censor those other events, first of all, you haven't specified what question that means, what question that corresponds to. But if you want to do that, one possible option is the following. What would happen if I not only intervened on the treatment, but I also intervened due to not be able to die from any other cause? And there's discussion about people being fine or not about that. I don't think it's important for public health, because there is no intervention in this world to remove all causes of death except prostate cancer. So it's basically something that's not relevant for the stuff we are doing in this world at this time. And also the intervention itself is ill-defined, because here I confidently say this would be what would happen if we could remove all kind of other types of death. But how can we do that? So how can we even talk about this concept? So that's a problem. And so now I'm kind of talking about the problems with existing things using this lens. But how about all these hazards estimates? Because we read traditional articles, they would say, well, if you're interested in etiology, which begs some causal, has some causal flavor to it, they would say, do a cause-specific hazard. If you're interested in these other things, do a sub-distribution hazard, etc. So the problem with hazard estimates, and there are several different of them, here I list 3, is that when you compare 2 different hazards at some time after baseline, say after 1 year, you would compare different people in the 2 arms. So this is the basic idea about why I and others think that the hazard analysis are sometimes not ideal for causal inference is that suppose we study here in this prostate cancer trial, hazards after say 2 years. So those who survive after 2 years in the treatment arm are not the same as those who survive in the control arm. So that means that you compare apples and bananas. So this was exactly why the reason why the observational studies got it wrong when they tried to study hormone therapy in postmenopausal women, because they didn't start following up the women exactly at the time they started to take hormone therapy, but they took current users that could have been standing on those for several years, and some of them had stopped because they already had a cardiovascular event and were not included. So it's the same kind of bias, and that's the intrinsic bias of hazard ratios as well. Okay, so my point here is that these are really of those strategies I know in the literature, plus, for example, something I haven't mentioned, but we'll get back to later, these so-called principal stratum estimates. These are really what exists in the literature, or was the existing estimates in the literature. So we may try to come up with some alternative, which may not work in all settings. I'm not claiming that this works in all settings, but it's a solution in some settings. And it really, the motivation for it is that we start with the question. And before we go into this motivating question, I will just give the idea in a graph. So if we just focus on this first part of this graph, where we only have the black arrows, we could think about the following. We could think about that the original treatment, and this does not need to be a physical decomposition of that thing, but you can think about the original treatment as having some component. So it was one pill, but it was estrogen treatment, okay? But we could think about it as this estrogen treatment had some desirable component in an abstract way, which is the fact that it reduced production of testosterone. So it affected here prostate cancer deaths through that pathway. But the other potentially potential component that is unideal, that we don't really want, is the fact that it may increase clotting factors and a lot of other things. Estrogen is a hormone. It has not a single specific mechanism of action. Okay, so we can ask the following question. What would be the effect if we only gave this testosterone component? So the component that reduces testosterone. And did I say, that's why I alluded to early on, could there be any other ways of reducing testosterone production? And where is testosterone produced? In the male testicles. So the most simple and barbaric way is to remove the testicles with castration, and they do sometimes. So in a way, I'm not making sci-fi here compared to the other things. We could think about the treatment that reduces testosterone in that particular way. And today they also give other hormones. They have more fancy hormones. They don't give estrogen. That's on the list of possible treatments, a cheap one, but they would give something that worked directly on the pituitary gland, that removes this cardiovascular effect, or does not have the cardiovascular effect of estrogen treatment. Okay, but the idea here is that if you want to know the mechanism by which this estrogen treatment works, we can think about what would happen if we gave this selective treatment that has some of the effect. And I'll give you other examples too. So we took and stretched this idea to the limit and defined that as a framework of thinking about mechanisms by which a treatment affects things. And why are we interested in these things? Because you could say all we have at this point in time is estrogen. And then I would say, well, if you want to develop new drugs or get refined treatment and understand how they work, this may be what you need for the next step. But what is the downside? You should have the intuition is that now I talk about these hypothetical drugs, but I didn't have those drugs in the trial. I had two arms. I had estrogen treatment and placebo. So the statistical question, can you study the effect of these hypothetical treatments only from those data? It was a trial, and it had this interpretational problem I said in the beginning, which it's still there in the trial. So the next step is, can we try to get more information? Yes, but we pay a price, more assumptions. By the way, if you go back, and I'll just back, all of these four other estimates here, except the first one, would also require at least as strong assumptions as those I will get now. Okay, So I was here. So now when we have just invented, just pull them out of a hat. So now we need to get the justification of them. And I kind of did in this study because I said castration was an alternative. But then we can define effects, new type of effects. So before, that's why I was so spent some time on introducing the superscripts, because those are important to define effects. So a direct effect would be the effect of only giving this testosterone component, so putting that to 1 versus 0, and keeping this other component to, here I said AD, but I could set that to 0. So which means that I would not like to give that other component. I don't want to increase the clotting factors. So that's the direct effect. Then the indirect effect would be the opposite. I only give that clotting factor. I mean, this would be completely unethical, so I would not be able to do that kind of experiment, but I can still define the effect. Okay. So the nice thing is that when we define the effect this way, and that's a simple algebra thing, is that they would sum up to these cumulative incidence curves that we are used to, and we could fit with any other software we have. So then we kind of decompose it into the direct and indirect effect. So the direct here was the one we intended to have, and the indirect is coming from these pathways we want to avoid. But again, I said there's no free lunch in the sense that we need assumptions to get there. And we want to be transparent about these assumptions, so let's present them. And the idea is that now we have these two components. Each of them could take values 0 and 1. So we have 4 different combinations there. Whereas in the trial, we only observe when the components are given jointly. So either you get none, that's placebo, or you get both, that's estrogen. Okay, and now these graphs are here more for the completeness, not for anything else. The reason why I give this graph again here now with the components instead of the original treatment, is that these are helpful when we need to reason about what do we need to measure in order to study these effects. And essentially, the short story is we need to then, in the same way as we need to do in observational studies, we need to adjust for common causes here of the event of interest and the competing event. Whereas usually it's between the treatment and the event of interest. But that we need even in the randomized trial. So it means that, yes, you could have common causes of the event of interest at different times, and also these baseline factors, not a problem. The gray ones, not a problem. The same would be if you have common causes of the competing event at different times, not a problem. It would be a problem for some of these hazard things, but we could not have this U here. So unmeasured things that causes Y, and that we need to measure. That's a bit depressive, but we can do sensitivity analysis, and we can strive when we design the trial to collect as much as important information as we can. So it shouldn't prevent us from asking the questions. This is just to show you how the math works in the identification formula. So this, in the end, is what you want to estimate. So now, and the reason why I show it is not that you should glance on it and it should be useful. It's more that actually it turns out that each of these terms are hazard terms. So even if I somehow trash the interpretation of hazard, I don't think hazards are meaningless or useless at any point. I mean, I think they're very useful for modeling. I just want to transform them. So it means that you use the classical software. It's a bit more about it in the paper. You use the classical software, all you know, but you just transform it in a slightly different way. So if we go back to this example and then analyze the data, it will look like the following. So the notation then will be, and this is just repetition, this component is the component that affects prostate cancer specifically. The other one is the component that affects death due to other causes. Okay, so now we can add this green curve. So the green curve here corresponds to giving the prostate cancer component, so reducing testosterone production, but not giving that potentially a harmful component. And what do we see? Well, this green curve is now, there's a quite considerable difference between this green curve and the red curve. And what does that mean? It means that if you only give this component, that reduces testosterone production and keeps this other component as if you gave nothing, so placebo, then you still reduce prostate cancer death quite a bit. Which means that, yes, this estrogen treatment did reduce prostate cancer death precisely because it reduces testosterone production. And this is why they have new treatments today. I mean, they didn't do this in the trial, but it's kind of reverse engineering the problem from the 1980s. And in the same way as people tried to do observational studies to confirm that the trial results are good and that kind of stuff. So this, yeah.
So you have drawn the graph and you have drawn the green.
Yeah, yeah.
Green
So this is my
the identification formula on the slide before.
Exactly. Okay, that's all I did. But now I gave you a polished story because, I mean, this is a small trial. It didn't have power to study that green curve because I needed more assumptions and I needed more evolved statistical analysis than just doing normal cumulative incidence with all the Johansen estimators, which are the black and the red. So if you look at the confidence intervals, they're wide. So if you were to interpret the differences in terms of confidence intervals, you wouldn't be that certain about these things. But the point is that the estimates are different. So you get different numbers. So you'll get to different conclusions. The sample size grows, maybe that's it. So this was the first example. So you may think now, okay, this is very particular. I just gave a rhetoric story where this works, or I claim it works. But does it generalize? Is it something that we can use in other settings? And is this a way to think about mediation analysis more broadly? And by the way, Jamie Robbins and Thomas Richardson should get a lot of the credit for these things because in 2010, they had this decomposition idea when they were fighting with Julia Pearl. And Jamie Robbins is a medical doctor. Julia Pearl is a computer scientist. And Jamie Robbins loves to say that he is a medical doctor and knows the subject matter. So this was a discussion about the same kind of thing. And this is a bit of an anecdote. It was about cigarette smoking and about tar. So the question was, how much is tar in the lungs, or how much is the effect on cancer, say, due to nicotine? And then at that point, they didn't use this e-cigarette all the time. And I live in Lausanne. I mean, Philip Morris is selling these e-cigarettes to everyone. So there are so many people smoking these vapors, right? That's precisely a decomposition of a normal cigarette, right? You get the nicotine component, but not the tar component, right? So this is how they kind of argue that, yeah, we remove most of the harmful. And here's another one. So this is from a good clinical oncology journal, a journal of clinical oncology, which is many people regard as the top one. And here's the question is slightly different, but the setup is similar, but different. And it's still prostate cancer, but now there are two different treatments. So one cocktail is this docetaxel and estramustin. And I don't really know the mechanism of actions of these two drugs, honestly, but they were compared to another cocktail, which is one other chemotherapeutic agent here, mitoxantrone, and just steroids, okay? So the first thing they saw was that, yeah, if you give this DE, I will call it now, the first combination, then you have better survival compared to MP, so the one with steroids, okay? So that was their initial finding, and I think it was published in New England Journal of Medicine. And then but then in the oncology environment, we know that they're not only interested in mortality, they're also interested in quality of life. So how do we study quality of life here? So you may think it's easy. We study quality of life, but then some people died, right? I mean, in fact, most people died in both arms. So you can't study quality of life unless you're alive. And that is a problem, right? Because then you study quality of life among those who are alive. But suppose I make a more extreme example. So I say, I have a new chemotherapy, so 100% survives. And I compared it to placebo and 10% survived. Okay, so if I look at quality of life in those 10% who survived with placebo, who are those 10%? My intuition would be those are the really healthy young ones that had a mild form of the cancer that would survive anyway. Okay, so now you look at quality of life in those young, healthy individuals versus 100% in the treatment arm. Also, the old people with previous heart attacks and were going around with major pain and so forth, right? So this is a randomized trial again. You can't just study quality of life in survivors because when different groups of people or different amounts of people survive in the two arms, they're not comparable. Okay, so what do we do? And here's another setting that may also be in infectious disease settings and beyond is that also in COVID, in fact, is that in some settings, and this is a very particular one, but during the Corona early phase of the COVID pandemic in 2020, they were discussing whether that if you are infected, and many of us were, like after 3 doses of the vaccines, if you are infected, even if you were fully vaccinated, are your symptoms milder or stronger compared to those who were unvaccinated? And all this, I mean, I'm the biggest fan of vaccines. I would have been going to a challenge trials to do vaccines, right? So I don't say this because to make any skepticism, but the argument is the following. This was a JAMA publication where they were arguing about these things. So I'll show that, jump over some examples. And they were saying this: one concern about COVID-19 vaccines is that antibody-dependent enhancement, so that's a phenomenon that's known, that sometimes can happen, could make subsequent coronavirus infections more severe in those who are vaccinated. And one reason, and this is a serious publication, and one reason they were saying was that you may add an adjuvant to the vaccine, such as alum. It's very cheap. So when you make the vaccines, you want to use something that's available and reasonably cheap as an adjuvant to the vaccines. But suppose that adjuvant induced some T cell response or something like that, then you could get worse symptoms. So it wasn't biologically totally far-fetched. It wasn't the case. They have not given evidence afterwards that this is the case, but this was the hypothesis in 2020. But my point here is just that this is, again, an idea about the decomposition, because you could use that vaccine in a trial, compare it to placebo or a mock vaccine, and then you could afterward ask the question, what would happen if I remove the adjuvant from this vaccine? And in this cancer therapies trials, you could ask the same thing. You could, just to bring the idea in, you could ask the question, what would happen if because why are they interested in quality of life? Because the chemotherapy can lead to all kind of weird symptoms. You give it to the whole body, right? You can get problems with the bowels, you would get fatigue, you can get all kind of, you lose the hair. These are small things, but in the long run, they can also have more severe symptoms, totally depending on the chemotherapy. But we can ask the hypothetical question: if we could give a more targeted chemotherapy, which they, by the way, try to do, such as giving it in new kind of particles, nanotherapy, and these kind of things, or injecting it into the tumors, then we could perhaps remove some of these undesirable components of the treatment. So the reason why I give these stories is that this seems to be the reason why many people, and I have other examples, but I'm not going to spend time on them, the reason why people are interested in these mechanisms or mediation questions. And it's not even just in medicine. So this here I will reverse engineer an example from economists who talk about job training programs or educational programs. And they would say, they would do this same thing. They will have the same problem as they had in the vaccine study and this study with quality of life. They would say, but I can't look at the exam scores unless they meet the exam. But I gave the training program half a year before the exam. So I can only look at the scores. Of course, I could define it to be 0 if they don't meet the exam, but they were interested in the scores among those who actually participated. Okay, so now I'll give you exactly the same notation. So it's a binary treatment, discrete time points. We still can have now death, but now it's from anything. But then the difference is only the following, that the outcome here, for example, quality of life, is only defined if you are alive. So D is equal to 0. It's undefined if it's D equal to 1. But you may now say, I don't care. Like, we could do quality adjusted life years. That's what people do in a lot of health and economic settings already. And I agree with that. You can. You can do that fully. And you can say that quality of life is 0 when you're dead. You can that too. But sometimes they ask the following question: is it the effect of the drug? Is it the harmful effect that goes through, say, some, outside of the effect on mortality? So here we give the chemotherapy to keep individuals alive and remove the cancer. But do they have harmful effects that we potentially could eliminate in the future? Is that the mechanism? And if you study these other outcomes, we can't say that. We can't study that question. And now to say that a bit more formally, this is exactly the same as a hazard argument. So what they did in the study, they would look at those who survive under treatment here versus control. But then I argued those are different groups of individuals. We can't compare them even in a randomized trial. So this contrast, which is usually given, doesn't have this clear causal interpretation as the effect on quality of life. We could again also do the same trick about censoring on death. So we could censor everybody who's dead. We know how to do that in the computer. Just say, oh, they're censored, so don't look at those individuals. And under some assumptions, we can then define what would happen if everybody were alive. But I don't know how to do that, because if I were, I had the perfect chemotherapy already. And that's not what they're studying. So there are other alternatives. And now I go to this principal stratum effect, or survivor average causal effect that I already mentioned. So I could look at the effect of treatment. Here's only treatment versus control among those who survive regardless of chemotherapy. So regardless of they got chemotherapy 1 or 0 or placebo or control. So that sounds okay. But the problem is, can I ever observe these individuals? And the answer is no, because I can give people chemotherapy and then I can see a month later, 1 year later, did they survive or not? But I can't then go back in time and say, oh, what would happen if I gave the same individual control and then follow them a year? I don't have a time machine. So essentially it's a quantity it's a causal effect in the sense that here we compare we have the same conditioning set. So we compare the same individuals. But as some of my UK friends said, one of them used to be in Bristol, they say that this is the example of a pure mathematician's approach to a practical problem. And this is not the way I want to approach a practical problem. They're stranded on a desert island with no food supplies. But a crate of tin tuna, he imagines a can opener. So essentially, yeah, you give a solution, but it's not helping us very much. So before I finish, I will just say that our approach to this problem is precisely the same as in the previous example on estrogen therapy. And that is, and I conjecture that it will work well in this JAMA and COVID example and others as well. Here's the proof that what I said about the alum adjuvant, that's what they actually wrote in this paper. And here's a third one that I didn't go through in details, but this is about a similar phenomenon called anti-drug antibodies, which is a problem with new treatments of new anti-immune treatments given in particular for multiple sclerosis and other autoimmune diseases, where you can have antibodies that neutralize the drug itself. And then you may also want to add a component to the drug that stops this neutralization. Okay, so essentially it's the same idea. You think about now, what is the effect of the component that solely affects quality of life versus the component that has this desirable effect to reduce mortality? And I'm showing this very simplified because the graphs could be much more complicated, for example, like this. And in some of these settings, we could still argue in the same way, but when the graphs gets too complicated, and this is just a more warning sign, I'm not going into the details, we can't do the same thing. So this is just a feature of reality. It's not something we always can do. Okay, but then we can define these effects. And now the only difference from before is that we now define this effect conditional. So it's still effect of this direct component. You give this component that here could be harmful or good for quality of life versus not. And you give all of them the component of the chemotherapy that has the intended effect on mortality. Like it specifically targets the cancer cells. And you look at the effect among those who would survive when you give them this thing that targets the cancer cells. Okay. So if you do that, and this is all I would show here in the end, and this doesn't give you a lot of intuition, that's not the point. The only thing I want to say is that if you do this kind of other analysis, you will get numbers that are different from what you do when you do the naive contrast. So the naive contrast would compare the first and the second line. What I would suggest, which is not the only solution to this example, but could be a helpful one, is to, oh, you may not see it, is that comparing one of the three lower ones. So there are three lower ones, they're all different estimators. And I haven't talked much about estimations, but it's the same cake we target, but we use a different recipe. But they all target the same cake, okay? And the numbers here are quite similar, but they're different from those. That's the whole point. Okay, so what is the summary? So I'm on the 45 minutes now. This idea of thinking about more detailed question or mechanisms, and I think that's the same as mediation. And I know others agree and some disagree, but more and more agree, I think, is that we need to think carefully about the question and these reasons why we are interested in these more complex mechanisms. And a statistician I like a lot, who is not in the medical domain, but he's a very clever thinker. He even said in the talk that he feels this is a feature and not a bug. So the fact that we need to be very specific about the questions and sometimes use biological or medical knowledge to frame the questions is a good thing, because it clarifies when these effects are relevant for anything practical. And it's also a good exercise in the sense that then we need to force ourselves to be precise and think about what it could be used for in, say, future treatment, where the direction of research is going. And from the technical side, we didn't rely on this hypothetical interventions that are possibly defined, and we didn't use these cross-world independence assumptions, which are in the causal inference literature a bit. Well, philosophically, the point with this, you may have heard the word, even if you're not working in the field, cross-world independence means that we need some independence assumptions that are untestable, even in principle. It means that you can't, it's from a Popperian view on science, you cannot go in the future and check if the assumption was wrong. You just need to accept it as something. And that's not always appreciated. So thank you. Here are some references. I'm happy to do that. Thank you.
I think thinking about the question very carefully is something we really all could support. Are there any questions? You're here.
Thank you. Very nice talk and very inspiring indeed. I might ask a question that you might have answered in your last slide, but because it went a bit quickly, no, in the slide before.
Yes.
So in principle, this idea of treatment decomposition could be applied for any competing outcomes.
Yeah.
Or more or less.
Yeah.
What if your competing outcome is, efficacy of the intervention versus dropout from the trial? And you can assume there are two components that control the side effects that lead you to dropping out the treatment or lack of efficacy.
And often it's due to a side effect, right? So
yes.
In this case, drop out or doing a rescue treatment or something.
Yes, exactly. So would in that case, this approach of treatment decomposition gives similar results to adjusting for dropout and estimating the causal effects using inverse probability weighting?
In the sense that, because then when you use inverse probability weighting, you would usually, I would imagine it as a case where you ask the question, what would happen if nobody dropped out or nobody took rescue treatment? Things like that. In this case, this would be, what would happen if people dropped out and took rescue treatment in the same way as they would do it during placebo? So it would be, they would still allow some to take rescue treatment, but not more in the treatment arm than in the placebo arm. So that's, instead of saying nobody can take it, you would say only the same number can take it in the treatment arm. It's slightly different, but similar.
Okay. And do you see it on the top of your mind, any important difference in the underlying assumption between these two?
No, often they would rely on very similar assumptions. But one problem is if, suppose the following, suppose that certain people would always take rescue treatment in both groups because they were just doomed to do so. I can come up with an example, but some people would get a progression of the cancer anyway, and they would always go to second line treatment, or they would have more pain if it was a pain drug, so they would always get on, some opioids or something. Then you can't do a normal inverse probability. The reason is you don't have positivity, so you don't have any observations of those. But in this setting, we would allow those people to continue doing it. So sometimes you have, I said, slightly weaker assumptions, and that's one example.
I see. Okay.
Thanks, Sophia. Question? Yeah, Michael, you want to go first?
Yes, okay.
But thanks for a very nice talk, Max. I think I've missed because the slide was too fast and the most important part, which was the
Go back.
identification formula.
And I didn't give very much, but I can give. I only gave it for the first thing, so I go back quite a lot.
I just
Here.
I just wonder maybe if you can all of us give us an intuition on how that would differ from a normal G computation formula where, for example, you want to intervene on that. I mean, it would be like another option for us, to have some identification where we intervene on that. It would be another estimate, as you said.
Yeah.
But what makes the magic work? I mean, how can you really separate, and what's the crucial part in it?
That's a good question, and I can give it. This formula is precisely what we need to answer. So yeah, you're right. So when you intervene on that, we can think about this term being equal to 1. This term here, because then in that world, the probability of dying. So that's 1 minus this, right? This should be 1. So essentially, if you had put in that, the rest would collapse into what would happen at that one under that estimate. So if you look at the normal cumulative incidence, if I had instead of AY and AD and AY here, had a little a in all of these things, this would just be the G formula for the normal cumulative incidence. Okay. So the only difference is that one of these hazards has potentially a different value than the Y hazard. So this, if you wanted to do, I can see if I have I think I had a saver slide about the proof. So if you really, I can send it to you too. See here, suppose I wrote it out with laws of probability with the components AY and AD. Then one of the assumptions says that this Y thing is not affected by D. So I just chop that out. And here I chop out the AY part because this is only a function of the one. Then I get to this thing.
So to rephrase it, so what it means practically is we still use the observed, intervention, but our interpretation is different.
Yeah.
And practically when we plug in into that formula, the only difference, there's hardly any difference.
Yeah, exactly. So you could use all this, you could fit with the cause-specific hazard model in a software. One option is or logistic, a pool logistic model. The same with this and this. So you just combine this model.
So it's a standard,
in the G formula.
So it's a standard G formula with like your observed intervention.
Yeah.
So you're doing everything you would do in any case.
Yeah.
Except to give it a different interpretation.
Yeah. And slightly, like instead of having this equal to 1, you have now, you plug in some has. But you can go in the G formula package and do this yourself. In your favorite package, your package.
Okay. Now, Michael, was that all?
How do you know I have package?
I assume.
Any other questions from you? Oh, Veronica. Okay.
Yeah. So I want to ask about, you said that the one problem in estimating these decomposed effects is that if you have confounders between D and Y, and then you said that you can do some sort of sensitivity analysis to check whether there is a problem or not. And I think this external confounder issue is in general a problem with the causal inference. Can you tell me in this case what would be the sensitivity analysis that can tell us whether we are okay or not?
So first of all, you can't, as in any causal setting, you can't inform that sensitivity analysis with the data. Then you would need external data or subject matter knowledge.
So external data.
Yeah, but you can reason about it in several ways. So the intuition should be the following. So here's one thing. Suppose almost no people die of prostate cancer. That wasn't the case there. Suppose almost nobody dies of other events. Like that means that there are almost no competing events, right? So intuitively then the bias should be very small. So you can actually do bounds from a logic perspective without assumptions, saying when how possibly large the bias can be. So you can do that, and that can sometimes go. But I agree that we always need assumptions in causal inference. I think we should be accepting bounds and uncertainty more. That's my philosophical point on that. Because if we have a causal question, we have one option is to rely on assumptions that we may not believe in. Okay, maybe not the best. We can do sensitivity analysis, it's like 101, right? Like we want to do sensitivity analysis of bounds, and then people say, yeah, but it's uninformative. But then the world is uninformative of the question somehow, right? So, yeah.
You don't have any like specific sensitivity analysis, your favorite sensitivity analysis that you
Here?
practice? Yeah.
I have one general rule, and that is if the sensitivity parameter should be informed by subject matter knowledge or questions, and not only, you know, here's a plot, here's how big it could be. People need to, as long as you can interpret. And I suggested one in one of the papers, but essentially, there is more work to do on that in this setting. But formally, you can use the results from mediation analysis and the sensitivity analysis that's done that. And the reason why is the following. All the things I've done is to almost, let me give a easier graph, is if you had swapped the D with an M, this would just be normal mediation. How much of the effect of A is mediated by M versus how much is the direct effect. And there's tons of mediation analysis, sensitivity analysis software, and that could be adapted.
Okay. Oh,
I have one more. I mean, just also out of
go ahead. Yeah.
out of practical interest. Because Mats, you talked about the principal stratum effect, which is also known as the survivor average causal effect.
Yes.
Something I've not used so far, but I would like to use. And I'd like to give a counter argument why you should use it.
Yeah.
As a mathematician solution to a practical problem.
Yeah.
So say, for example, so the survivor average causal effect is saying, what's the effect of the intervention on the outcome among the subpopulation of those patients who would have survived irrespective of the treatment given.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, if you think of the whole population, that may cause, of course, some selection bias. But say in some of the settings we work, maybe the amount of, like, say, the competing event is death, and death is not so high, and your outcome of interest is something like immune recovery, growth, weight, whatever. And actually the proportion of people who die are relatively small. So the amount of people who have like a competing event are very small. I mean, relatively small. The absolute numbers might be big, but relatively small. So what's wrong in just saying what's the effect of the intervention and the treatment on a subpopulation that's interesting to us? I mean, what's the, I wouldn't say it's a mathematician solution, it's a practical solution.
My problem with it is that it's a subpopulation that's unidentified. So you could never do a decision and say you are in that subgroup. And in fact, we don't know if anyone, you can make bounds on it. So you made the premise that it's a reasonably large subgroup of the population. My problem is that we don't know who they are. So you come in to the doctor and you want to have chemotherapy, and suppose most people survive. And I say the effect, first of all, like there's tons of problems with identifying it and estimating it. But then I say, this is the effect among those who would survive regardless of treatment. And then I say, but I don't know. I mean, I'm taking this chemotherapy because I want to know if first of all, I want to survive, right?
But that's an individual causal effect. In any case, we're doing average causal effect. So wouldn't that be still, I mean, that problem of making a decision with an individual person you have with any of these approaches?
Yeah, but at least you know you're in one of the individuals in the population that you take an average of. And the other thing is, but I do agree in some settings it may be useful, but that's more actually in these settings where you strongly believe in the monotonicity assumption.
So that would have been my follow-up question. Sorry for asking so many questions, because I think I also didn't get so far. Yeah. Because my impression was you need assumptions to identify the survivor average causal effect.
Yeah.
And they're a bit stronger. I couldn't fully distinguish that from like the method you have now presented. And if you just have a sentence or two.
Yeah, I even have a slide. I showed one there.
What's the key difference? I mean, what's the main?
Okay, this slide gives it. So in one setting, it's the following. Suppose you add a monotonicity assumption. Mm-hmm. So what would that be in this setting? It would be if you die under treatment, you would also die under control. right? So in a vaccine setting, it would be, if I get vaccinated, if I get COVID when I was vaccinated, I would definitely also have gotten it if I weren't vaccinated. So the vaccine can increase my risk of getting COVID.
Yeah.
So now in a COVID trial, I would totally believe in that assumption because it was blinded. In real life, I wouldn't, because if I'm vaccinated, I start going to the restaurants all the time and drinking beer before I didn't do it, right? So it's not even clear there. In a chemotherapy study, it's not even clear that it holds either, right? Because, I mean, some chemotherapy takes people's lives. We know that. Like, some people can die, at least with surgery, it's clear, and from other treatments. And if we believe in precision medicine, we wouldn't believe in monotonicity, because we don't believe that everybody. Why do you study a treatment effect if you, by assumption, says you would definitely live longer with it or something? So this is my philosophical issue with the assumptions. But if you assume it, and in the vaccine setting in the trial, it's plausible because it's blinded. So you shouldn't change your behavior. Under that assumption, we could show that, in fact, the stuff I showed is similar to one principal stratum effect. But now need to be careful, because here I have this inequality. So it's the same as one so-called separable effect. But it's the separable effect among those who would survive under no treatment, right? Because they're always survivors. So this is a smaller population. Whereas I looked at the effect among those who would survive if I gave them chemotherapy. So in that sense, they would correspond to each other, but you have two options with these things.
So would it be correct? I'm still trying to get it. I'm just trying to find the right.
I'm wondering whether this conversation could continue, because he will stay on, and I just would like to ask others whether they have some questions, and we can continue, Michael, that conversation. Any other question? Okay, so I think we can conclude the seminar. Thank Mats again for a really very nice presentation, thought-provoking, and we'll continue to discuss among the idea group with Mats after this. Okay?